Welcome to Remarkable Retail Podcast, Season 6, Episode 16, presented by Market Dial. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
In this episode, our fourth and final full-length episode, we have one more bonus episode coming up. In a series of fantastic interviews conducted at Shoptalk in Las Vegas in the Wise Line podcasting studio, our guest is Rooijen, Chief Ecommerce Officer, Chalhoub Group.
Yeah, Ryan is a guy that I did not know, but we shared the stage at a conference a little bit over a year ago in Saudi, and I was like, who is this guy? First, when he walked up on stage with his fancy Christian Louboutin kicks.
He was notable in his...
Yes, I was like, wow, strong style game.
Yeah.
But more important than that, he dropped a serious amount of knowledge, and folks may think because, or they may or may not be familiar, hear more about the Chalhoub Group, but you may think this is going to be an episode about Middle Eastern retail, and it is not. It is about digital growth, e-commerce, omni-channel, whatever you want to call it, from a guy who really knows his stuff, has got a really interesting background.
You know, Ryan is an interesting cat because, as you said, he came out of the Google organization. Like, he's got lots of tech background. So then he found himself at the Chalhoub Group. So again, you get best of both worlds, right? You get his perspective on tech, and then you get a bit of sense of how the Chalhoub Group operates, which is super interesting. So we're recording this on our last day in Barcelona after the World Retail Congress. Don't miss our bonus episode we just published last Friday, all about the event. Now I'm back to Toronto Saturday, and then off to Montreal for a speaking gig next week. You're sticking around, right?
Yeah, a few hours. I'm getting on the train up to Madrid to meet up with my older daughter, Elena, and we're going to do a week's vacation, travel around Spain.
Nice.
And then I'm hopping on over to the Copenhagen area to do a speech at a private company event, and then back to Barcelona to participate in Shoptalk Europe. So it's a little bit crazy. I will have been gone from home for about 3 weeks and probably put on 20 pounds.
Well, I tell you, you got to be careful because the food here is amazing. We were in the Gothic Quarter last night together. It was just fantastic. And by the way, your sense of direction, navigating us through the Gothic Quarter, very impressive, my friend.
Retail thought leader and Spanish neighborhood navigator, and Steve Dennis.
And Spanish Gothic Quarter Sherpa. There we go. All right, let's get
a lot of money in that. For you kids thinking about a career change.
Let's get to the news. So the first thing that happened when we were here is actually last night during dinner, because we're 6 hours ahead, Amazon earnings were released. So looked overall like good news. I get a good sense from the top line media that things were well received and things are generally positive. Tell us what you read of the report.
Well, a couple things. Yes, you're right. It's been interesting just listening, and who knows what it's going to be by the time this episode airs. But yeah, the initial reaction was very positive because they beat expectations on the top line as well as on expected earnings. Then the tide sort of changed a little bit. So the stock looks like it's going to open down. And when we're recording this, the market's not open yet. So we shall see. And then the futures for some of the other tech companies have been down as well. So we'll see how that all plays out. And I think it's mostly related to two things, which have nothing to do with retail, so I'll make it quick. It's Amazon Web Services that the growth has slowed, still up 16%. It's nice growth, but the growth has slowed.
Their cloud computing division, by the way, for the listeners.
And their margins are down. So I think
in their retail, like they're very complex companies.
In the Amazon, no, this is just AWS we're talking about, which is B2B.
Yeah.
So I think as people look at Meta and Google and a bunch of other companies in the tech sector, indication that corporations are pulling back on some of their technology spending more broadly. That seems to be the Friday interpretation. What that looks like by the time this comes out, we'll see. Right. But to talk more about what we care mostly about on this pod, the retail side of it, the business to consumer. Bit more of a mixed picture. First-party sales, so that's the stuff where Amazon buys the merchandise and sells it themselves.
Yep.
Flat. Third-party sales continue to be up pretty strongly. Physical store sales, which is almost entirely Whole Foods, up 7%. So Whole Foods seems to be on a better trajectory than they had been for the last.
That could be could be food inflation, though.
Well, right.
Unit sales.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and then even just stepping back, maybe a different take on this. The thing that's so hard about business to consumer part of Amazon, it's a bundle of stuff. So you've got first party, third party, which is really a service business. You've got advertising.
Yeah.
You've got the Prime bundle, which is both, prepaying for delivery and then all the
movies,
media content,
the movies and all that stuff,
and so
audio.
And by the way, and I know I've said this in the past on the pod, Amazon does not make it easy to unpack what is really going on. So you have to make a bunch of inferences. What I would say top line is advertising continues to grow very nicely. The actual retail part of it and subscription services as well, double-digit growth. So that's the Prime bundle. The retail part of it, kind of flat. Fulfillment costs growing and SG&A growing faster than sales. But altogether, the profits improve. So my conclusion from that is that the profitability is being driven by the mix shift to advertising and the incredibly high margins. Now, you really, as I've also talked about, you really can't look at advertising margins independent from retail margins because basically retail is the traffic driver. Right. And, I always say it's like selling the razors and the blades or, a bunch of analogies like that. So, but overall from a selling stuff to consumers, not selling ads to companies, business doesn't look that strong. Yeah. So it continues to be a really mixed picture, and it's a very complicated company to understand because they've got this big B2B part, AWS and ads, which is very strong and profitable, and then stuff they sell to consumers, which is the way most people think about Amazon, doesn't look that strong. So, and basically they gave pretty weak guidance, and I don't think there's a lot of evidence that all the discussion about rationalizing warehouse capacity and cutting cost, there's not great evidence that they're seeing a lot of that quite yet.
Well, super interesting business, and I guess a couple of thoughts. We just did our bonus episode. You can page back again for the World Retail Congress, but there wasn't a whole lot of talk, at least on the stage, about the retail media networks. There was a lot of talk in the hallways, actually, but not much on the stage, right?
That's actually really interesting. So, two things on that. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because yes, unlike what we saw at Shoptalk and NRF, very, very little about that. So that's interesting. The other thing and I know I've made this comment before on the ad part of Amazon, I continue to believe, with no evidence other than my interpretation, that part of the reason why first-party retail is so weak is because the customer experience is terrible on Amazon. I think the more they drive
They're sacrificing customer experience for their retail media sales.
And I would say third-party. It seems to me like you go to Amazon, all the reasons we go to Amazon to find stuff, but basically they're trying to push ads and push third party because those are the high margin businesses for them. And I just think long term that's a mistake. I think the balance has to be better. So Andy Jassy, if you're listening, there's my free consulting advice. I'll send you an invoice.
Well, and shout out to the people at Amazon who may or may not be listening, but Mr. Jassy, you're very, very welcome to join us on the pod.
The door is always open for Andy.
And do explain yourself and your company. We would much appreciate it. On our last episode, we foreshadowed, I guess wasn't very difficult to foreshadow the impending bankruptcy for Bed Bath & Beyond, but that's... We record on the Friday. It declared on the weekend. You predicted that would happen, so it's happened. So any thoughts wrapping that kind of story up as they head into the sunset?
Yeah. Well, as you said, it wasn't much of a prediction because it was very clear they were on a bad trajectory, and the rumor mill was very strong going into the weekend that was going to happen. So not a surprise. I think maybe a bit of a surprise is even though they filed for Chapter 11, which, not to get into the weeds on legal stuff, technically means they intend to reorganize as opposed to Chapter 7, which is a liquidation. They appear to be liquidating. They've indicated that their plans are to close all their stores. They have indicated that they are looking for a buyer, and we shall see. I mean, they were looking for a buyer before they filed, so that's not news. Obviously, their negotiating position is a little different.
Or you're buying a very different thing because they can get out of their leases. So in some ways they're more interesting to look at.
Yeah, it's probably pretty much a fire sale. There's been some discussion that perhaps they will reemerge as an online-only retailer. We've seen that happen a few times. I don't think that's super interesting in terms
of... Not to anyone, yeah.
I mean, Circuit City is still technically continues, but nobody thinks about Circuit City.
There's a long list
anymore.
of these companies that went into the pure play killing ground of close my stores and open up online.
Yeah, so I don't, maybe that'll happen. Who knows? I don't think that's super interesting, big picture. The one thing I was just going to mention, which I love sort of as a gangster move, is that Container Store announced that well, first of all, there was this announcement that you have until Wednesday, which has now passed, to use your coupons, the very famous 20% off coupons. And so people needed to really jump on that if they wanted to use them. And then Container Store came along and said, no worries, we will take your coupons through the end of May.
Nice. And shout out to our guest on the pod, Satish, and the folks at Container Store.
Yeah, so that was interesting. And the other thing that I noticed recently is that the Container Store seems to be adding more merchandise that you would typically find at a Bed Bath & Beyond. So, for example, they have this big OXO. People may be familiar with that brand, big OXO displays, at least in the Dallas store that I visited last week.
Kitchen utensils and tools.
Yeah. So, obviously a fair amount of volume is going to be going somewhere, and so I expect
not as much volume as anyone likes because they failed for a reason.
Well, I was going to say, it's been they've lost so much volume over the last several years that a lot of that has already migrated elsewhere. But in terms of what's still left, and some of the vendors like an OXO, and I'm sure some other important vendors where Bed Bath & Beyond is either their biggest account or one of their biggest accounts.
Sure.
I'm sure those conversations were going on well before the filing. So we'll see how that all shakes out.
What's their I can't remember. What's their baby division? Their
Bye Baby.
Bye Baby. I guess is that Bye as well? Because
Bye for yes. They're closing those stores as well. Yeah.
Okay. Which is what they did in Canada. I didn't even know they existed actually in Canada. So like Bye Baby.
It's a little bit of a problem.
It is. I mean,
though you haven't had to be fair, you haven't had a baby.
I'm not in the market.
While.
I am allegedly in retail though. Let's talk about Target. Target announced something that we and our guest talked about many, many months ago. Let's talk about that.
Well, Target continues to do a lot of things around, I guess, you could call it, I call it harmonized omni-channel fulfillment. And they were testing they've been doing, online pickup at store, curbside for quite some time. That was launched during COVID. Then they were testing the ability to do curbside returns. And they've now announced they're going to roll that out to the entire chain. And I think this is I have some sense of what the economics could be. I know that the pushback generally is we want to get the customer in the store.
Yeah. And the return is a good opportunity to do that.
Well, yeah. Well, I can say when we tested, we launched online returns. This is in some ways not so interesting, but we launched online returns to store when I was at Neiman Marcus in maybe 2006 or 2007. And part of the argument, even though it added a lot of cost and it got inventory in a place that caused some complications.
Creates footfall.
The argument was, we get incremental traffic. And as it turned out, when we tested it, people bought more stuff. When you start to say, well, you don't actually have to come into the store, that's a tougher argument. But I think, consumers love it. And I think what you have to believe is it's going to all work out in the mix.
Yeah.
If you get more loyalty, higher net promoter scores, yada, 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 that will ultimately pay off, even though you don't get the leverage on that particular trip. So they tested it. I assume they like the results. Yeah. And so I think other retailers should pay attention to it, frankly. Yeah,
they're not really an organization that just kind of stumbles into these kind of things without a lot of clarity around it. You called out something from LL Bean around social media. What did you see?
Yeah, so this is, I believe, the second year in the row that LL Bean is going to go dark on social media for the entire month of May. And it's really to call attention to mental health issues. And so I think it's just a great, kind of purpose-driven move. We talked in the bonus episode about Scott Galloway in particular, talking about the damage that social media can do. Not that that's a necessarily new and original idea, but I think it's just interesting for a retail brand, and particularly, in this era where social media is so important to branding and driving traffic and all that kind of stuff. Here's a company that's saying, we're going to call attention to some of the concerns around social media and go completely dark for the entire month of May for the second year in a row.
Let's talk about this powerhouse LVMH. They had, I guess you would describe it as remarkable earnings. Unpack them for the listeners.
Well, they have been a pretty remarkable company, very successful company for many, many years. They reported their earnings this past week, which were pretty blockbuster. Their sales were up 17%. Now, a bunch of that is because of China in particular, reopening, more travel, that kind of stuff. So just like we talked about it with Hermes last week, I believe it was. So kind of a similar pattern. Their shares are up 30% since the beginning of the year. And, that's in the context of a stock market that's kind of all over the place.
Sure.
And as we alluded to, we talked about how the bonus episode, how LVMH is now a more valuable company than Nike.
Incredible.
Which was not obvious to me at all that was true.
Yeah.
They're also the first European company to get to over 500 billion in market value, and that makes them one of the top billion makes them one of the top 10 most valuable companies on the planet.
Wow.
So that's,
and what does it say about the luxury category, right? That's interesting.
Yeah, it's really the combination of...
What does it say about our society?
That's a whole other separate episode on that. But just the overall strength in luxury, the incredible margin structure, based on exclusivity and scarcity. But they also do a hell of a job managing. I mean, they have a ton of, I couldn't even rattle off all the brands they have under that umbrella. But the other thing, which is probably surprising to many people, who is the richest man in the world? Bernard Arnault, who is the CEO of LVMH. So quite a remarkable story.
Speaking of remarkable stories, I think you and I have talked about this. We're fans of Succession.
Oh, yes.
And there is some very interesting things happening in the family, right? Where Bernard has challenged his children to, I think he's give them homework, or they've each been an assignment. I mean, oh my God, it's like, was the show based? Anyway, it's very,
as much as people,
as
people think Succession is just about, more like kind of a Fox Media kind of thing. There's probably like a more direct line of sight, whether the writers think about it that way to LVMH, which is kind of interesting. Well, maybe I'll have to put a challenge out to my two daughters to, take over the podcast.
We're very funny, very good. We actually asked our guest from Spencer Stewart if they were involved in that, or what they thought of Succession, given that they talk a lot about it. She talked a lot about Succession, a little foreshadowing.
Yes, and as I recall, she said nothing.
Yeah, that's right.
So draw your own conclusions.
Succession, the process, not Succession, the TV show, or its anywhere, shape, or size familiarity with LVMH. All right, well, that's a great wrap on this episode. A special shout out to our friends at Canadian Tire, who were we ran into here, some of the folks I knew, and were kind enough to invite us to join them for dinner one night. It was great to get to know. It's a super interesting business, and of course, any excuse for me to throw in something from Canada, but there you go. They're more than just tires. Now, just before we get to our great interview with Ryan Den. Ryan, Chief Ecommerce Officer for the Chalhoub Group, let's hear from our presenting sponsor. If you're a retailer hungry for a better way to gain useful insight on the impacts of your store layout, design, and strategic initiatives, you need to know Marketile. Marketile is an easy-to-use testing platform that emboldens great decisions, leading to reliable, scalable results. With Marketile, you can be confident in the outcome of your in-store pilot initiatives before rolling them out across your fleet. Validate your remarkable ideas with Marketile's in-store testing solution. The proof is in the testing. Learn more at marketile.com. That's marketile.com.
Well, Ryan, welcome to the Remarkable Retail Podcast. It's great to reconnect with you. The last time I saw you in person was quite far away, but we can maybe get to that. But welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, guys.
You've journeyed a little bit to get here from Dubai, but before we get too far ahead, why don't we talk about if you could just give us a little bit of sense of who you are, what you do, where you work, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what you do and who the Chalhoub Group is.
Absolutely. So I currently lead e-commerce and digital for the largest luxury retail group in the Middle East. I've been there now about 3.5 years, 2 years in this role. Before that, I was the group's chief data officer. And before that, stints at Dyson, Google, and some startup stuff that clearly wasn't that successful. Otherwise, I'd be on a yacht and not here. Although we are in a poolside cabana, so things are looking up, guys. Yeah, things are
when not if, my
up.
Friend. When not if.
I appreciate it, Michael. Yeah, I need to hang out with you guys more often. And aside from my day job, I'm a very, very proud dad of two little kids.
Yeah, I understand. Isn't your youngest 5 months old? Or
absolutely. As she reminds us at 3 a.m.
So let's talk about Chalhoub. I imagine many people in our audience are familiar with the Chalhoub Group, but probably many aren't if they haven't spent any time in the Middle East or they don't work for the companies that you partner with. So tell us about the history, the scope, the scale, those sorts of things.
Absolutely. So the group's about 60 years old. Started with one brand, Christoffel, way back when in Syria, and since then, has grown to become the leading luxury partner in the Middle East for luxury. So we have 8 of our own brands, across footwear, beauty, home, etc. We then have a portfolio of over 300 brands in terms of franchises and joint venture partners. For the franchise brands, we partner with the brands to drive their business across the region. For the joint ventures, the leadership still sits with the brand HQs, but we support them on key elements of their operations.
And what are some of the brands that you represent, or you say represent, or how would you describe you partner
support
with?
So I think represent, isn't the worst, term in a way. I mean, obviously it's a very close partnership, but I think there's definitely an element of being incredibly cognizant of the brand DNA and the importance of representing that faithfully in the region, particularly when we talk about these iconic luxury brands. There's an incredible world of heritage that goes along with it. So a combination of representing and partnering with, in my e-com space, fantastic brands like Tory Burch and Swarovski and Michael Kors and Lacoste, etc. Beauty, YSL. Etc. And then our joint venture brands like Vuitton, Louboutin, Sephora, etc. So it's an incredibly broad mix, which is very exciting because we really have something for everyone.
Yeah. And not to get too into the weeds, but I imagine some people may not realize why it is that some of these brands that typically have their own country subsidiaries or what have you, don't do that in general throughout the GCC, as I understand it anyway.
Yes.
Can you explain that? And then what is it you bring to them, why they choose you, say, over, there are some other companies that do somewhat similar things?
Absolutely. So historically, there wasn't really a choice. If you wanted to operate in the region, you need to have a local partner, and you see this across every major industry. That said, what I think is incredibly exciting is that this has really opened up in the last couple of years, and governments are actively promoting the brands enter kind of markets directly. And so the role of us as partners changes from being almost like a mandatory element of operations to being very much an elective component. And so, as you say, it then becomes a question of, why would they choose to partner with you? And so, also when it comes to our teams, we spend a lot of time thinking about how can we really add value to the, kind of like fantastic capabilities that these brands have in-house. And so very much that then comes down to, how do we design great product experiences that are optimized for, the customer behavior and habits in the regions? How do we make sure that we have the right type of operations and last mile capabilities on the ground? How do we make sure that when it comes to content, right, we're able to, localize and make sure that, again, back to the brand DNA, we not only represent the brand faithfully, but also do so in a way that means they're locally relevant.
Well, you're here in Las Vegas, as we've been discussing here at Shoptalk. You rolled off the stage from yesterday. You were on the stage, making a bit of an impression with your footwear choices, by the way. I saw a few
Thank you, Louboutin.
This podcast episode sponsored by
Louboutin.
Well, you are a great ambassador of the brands because you wear them well, so to speak. But what kind of knowledge were you dropping on the stage, and what were you chatting about yesterday?
Gosh, that's a very kind way of putting it. I think I was pleading my ignorance in a way. I mean, so the conversation, was about retail excellence, in international markets, and I guess the point I was trying to bring across that there's temptation when you find yourself in a role like mine to say, okay, well, I need to reinvent the wheel, right? I need to put my stamp on things, and I'm going to shape it a certain way. But the reality is that when it comes to best-in-class e-commerce experience, when it comes to best-in-class omni-channel experiences, it's not really a mystery, right? I mean, people have been doing this for 10 years. I mean, I always joke that on occasion I look back at my notes from when I worked at Google a decade ago, and a lot of the kind of themes that I keep bringing up in meetings now in the region are, themes I was raising a decade ago, and when I worked in Europe and the US. And I think that realization, like I said, I think on the one hand is humbling, because it means that you just need to appreciate that you're not there to in every case be very special, etc. Sometimes it's just about applying what works. But at the same time, I think humility aspect's important, because it makes you appreciate that there's also a lot of regional specificities and idiosyncrasies that need to be respected in order to create a great experience. So.
Sure.
Kind of mileage will vary kind of thing, right?
Absolutely.
Or what did someone say to us, Steve, once? The ship, the fleet only moves as fast as the slowest boat kind of issue, right? So how do you raise all... Look at me. I'm talking metaphors till the cows come home here. Raise all boats. But really, that's part of the mix of the portfolio that you've got, right? Not everyone is at the same place, and how do you take the best practices that are appropriate to them at the right time?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think, there's obviously a difference in the overall digital maturity of brands in general, right? So
sure.
There's an element of kind of like sense checking and aligning with the global leadership to make sure that we're moving in lockstep with their strategy and not just freestyling, because that's how you build and maintain trust. And then secondly, as you say, ensuring that you're aware of where the key improvement opportunities are. So, for example, with one brand, who I shan't name, if an unbelievably kind of suitable product portfolio for the region, but when I took this role, the performance in Saudi was absolutely abysmal. And I remember being on a call with the brand. They were pretty upset. We're still very, very polite, but they were pretty upset. I worked in the UK long enough to be able to tell the difference. And the thing is, they were right. But what's interesting was that their initial feedback was, well, we need to completely start from scratch. We need to A and B and C, and because of course I was in a CDO role, Chief Data Officer, not Digital Officer role before, my initial instinct was, okay, well, let's start with data. And we actually realized that when it came to a lot of key aspects of the journey, search and merch, etc., the mobile experience, actually they were fine. Where everything went sideways was when it came to checkout and payment. There were different reasons for that, but basically by focusing on that element, we were able to just unlock literally like 350% growth last year, and I think that specific expertise and that ability to, as you say, really kind of zoom in on the areas where you can add the most value, I think is absolutely critical.
Off mic, we were talking about that we all attend a lot of conferences, and sometimes you hear great things, and sometimes you're kind of like, I can't believe you're saying that. In the day and a half since you've been here, you've been attending lots of... pick up any insights? Anything pop to mind? And all the meetings you've been having in and around with all the kind of things.
Absolutely. The challenge with having 70+ meetings is you kind of forget who said what. So I'm not going to attribute this properly.
We won't worry about attribution.
But somebody smarter than myself clearly said, when it comes to the overall on-site purchase experience, post-purchase experience, the omni-channel aspect of the business, we all agree, what good looks like. But in the next couple of years, we're going to have a bit of a rediscovery of what needs to happen on the front end of kind of search and merch. And I think that very much stuck with me because it's exactly what we've been seeing as well. So, especially in the luxury space, hey, do you go incredibly content heavy? Do you say this is all about, being editorial led, right? And elevated creative.
Storytelling.
Exactly. Yeah. Or is it really about certainizing because it's about educating the consumer and helping them navigate this increasing array of options, or is it actually about, having, very dense, elaborate, PLPs where they can get a feel for the full collection, etc. Is it about, like what like Snap, or a great partner of ours, are promoting, all about, this very much kind of lean in, active,
the build
AR. There's no, as of yet, I think there's no real consensus, and so we're exploring all those options. So I thought that was a very smart comment.
Isn't that a lot of, just follow on with that? And I hate this to be the answer because it's not very helpful, but isn't the answer it depends? Because I know, for example, even way back when at Neiman Marcus, when we were doing some of this customer journey mapping, we had time where the customer who would buy online would say, well, I just know I want that. Let's pick Christian Louboutin. I know I want to buy that pair of shoes. I don't live close to a Neiman Marcus store, or Christian Louboutin boutique, or Saks, or whatever. I'm just going to go on. I want the shortest path to purchase because I know exactly what I want. Whereas other customers are trying to put an outfit together, and they may or may not know much about the brand. And everywhere in between. And I think, that's part of the challenge, right, is you don't necessarily know in that moment
Absolutely, yeah.
what that customer is up to and what they really value to make that relevant.
Absolutely. I mean, it's you touched something incredibly important, which is we talk a lot about the customer journey, but of course there is no the customer journey, right?
Exactly.
It's the customer journeys. That said, I think what's interesting is that occasionally you get these new kind of like modalities, right? Be it shopping, media consumption, payment, whatnot, and it just drives a shift in how the masses respond. I mean, a great example is video content, right? Where when YouTube and Netflix really became a big thing. People are like, oh my god, video content is getting so much shorter, and what's going to happen to attention spans, right? And now I think the average kid probably has about a 7-second memory, thanks to what the app landscape looks like now, and of course that's not just related to one app, right? Yeah, TikTok might have started it, but you say the same thing on Reels, and arguably before TikTok you saw it on Vine. Now YouTube has YouTube Shorts that they're heavily promoting, and so I see the discussion around search and merge piece being similar in a sense that you're absolutely right. It's not like it's going to obviate the need for having this awareness and being able to cater to these multiple customer journeys, but I can definitely see a kind of like shift in the baseline expectation of what the shopping journey looks like.
What's your view on, and maybe this just reveals a pet peeve I have, but I've heard here in other conferences, not particular to Shoptalk, so much discussion about, it has to be seamless, it has to be frictionless. And there's a part of me which is, first of all, I've never heard a customer say, I'd really love you, except there's too many seams. So some of it is just, it's not something that customers ever talk about. But I almost feel like, and I'm sure you can find exceptions, that the speed of purchase has become table stakes. And so if you're not doing it, chances are you're behind. The hard part is, what I often call, how do you amplify the wow? What are those things that you really differentiate on incredibly relevant? And so I wish I would hear people talk more about what they're doing to really win that share of wallet, really get those high NPS scores. I don't think anymore automatically just a faster checkout experience is the unlock, right?
Yes.
It's probably because you're behind. And so we're talking about this as innovating to parity. Like, that's not innovation, that's catching up. Yes. What are you doing to really be remarkable?
Yes. I mean, it's funny.
Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. I mean, look, when people talk about seamless, they probably mean they want a subscription model so they can have that monthly recurring revenue, right?
Right.
Don't worry about payments. We'll take the money out of your account.
Don't worry about making a decision. We'll just take care of everything for you.
Done. Look, I think I think when people talk about the seamless piece, right, it's also because there's been this kind of a gradual, shift in how people view kind of like omni-channel, over the past couple of years. And what's kind of interesting to me is that, every time we have these new terms, and every time I hear the term phygital, it's like, ugh, it's like,
all right, you're my favorite
on
person
a chalkboard.
now.
I mean, unbelievable. but because to me, omnichannel is incredibly simple, right? It's two engines, right? It's an identity engine that says no matter where you are, who you are, right? Like, we can make sure that you have a consistent, identity, and therefore, personalization, experience, etc., across any touch point. And secondly, a universal transaction engine. So whatever modality you're in, whether you're in store, you're on store, on the phone, you're talking to a human, you're on the phone, you're on WhatsApp, you're on a freaking helicopter, right? doing clienteling. I don't care, right? You can transact, right?
Yeah.
And how do you marry those two? And I think in a world where you're constantly seeing omnichannel as, I'm adding this and adding this and adding this, I think the seamless discussion becomes a thing because it's almost like in building an enterprise kind of like architecture, right? If you add it by bolting on more and more and more, you eventually end up with all of these edge case, all of these kind of like friction points.
Right.
I think if you approach omnichannel, like the way I prefer to, I'm not saying that's the right thing, but it's like how I think about it, then there are no seams because it's just this thing that you're doing. And so as you say, like there's a litmus test, which is, okay, across all of our touch points, do we have this universal identity resolution? Do we have this universal transaction capability? The moment that you can say yes, right, or close enough, let's be honest, it's never quite yes, it's just always close enough, then, as you say, the majority of the energy should be spent on how do we differentiate. And so, for example, we're in the process of building a multi-million-dollar creative studio. We've hired a team of unbelievably talented and cool creative professionals. It's all the people that I wasn't cool enough at school to hang out with, and now I get to recruit them, which is almost as good. It's kind of like hiring friends.
Now, for those people, do you look for story? I mean, there's this been evolution where people started, I think, looking for direct response folks to be in social media. I want to see it performance-based. And then it's migrated to storytelling.
Yes.
To being very good storytellers first and let the rest of the business figure out. How do you think about that? Are you hiring storytellers? What are you hiring when you build a studio?
I think the answer
that?
is we're hiring both. So if I look at the studio team, we've got some incredibly talented professionals on the more creative side of the spectrum, right, in terms of kind of like asset production and styling and whatnot. But then we also have a entire business operations aspect to it, which is saying, okay, well, which key metrics are we going to improve on, right? Because at the end of the day, like in theory, everybody wants elevated creative all the time, but see, to your point earlier, I mean, if people have a very high directedness, know exactly what I want to purchase, they're probably not going to care about that so
I've already bought into the story. Just get me the
exactly.
give me the damn shoes.
It's about figuring out what are for those different journeys and those different need states. What type of material people are looking for. How do we kind of provide that? And so mind you, we're still in the process of launching this during the second half of this year, but really thinking about this as another business component, another lever that we can use to drive the overall success of our digital business, as opposed to, it's just cool to do some beautiful campaigns. I mean, don't get me wrong, it'll be amazing to do some cool creative campaigns. We'll definitely do that, but it's also really about.
It doesn't have to be either or, is what you're saying within the group. Quick question for you, and then pass the mic back to Steve. You've been doing this for a while. You mentioned, some of the stuff you were looking at Google on the other side of the table you're still thinking about now. But is there anything that, in your mind, has materially changed in the landscape over the past 10 years that you would say, well, this is a hallmark of change. I wouldn't have done this 10 years ago. This is a very different evolution. The length of video, shorts, for example, e-commerce and social media. Is there anything that stands out to you as like, this is materially different from when I started my journey, your journey in what
Absolutely.
you do?
So, look, I think on the one hand, I mean, you touched on with the kind of the media piece. I think the evolution of consumer expectation, right, is it's not only kind of accelerated, right, but I think people are a lot more vocal about it. Like before, it was a case like, oh well, the experience isn't amazing, but whatever, I'll kind of stick with it because it's okay. And I think particularly because of the proliferation of some very good consumer products, just the bar of what people expect and experience, particularly from a digital perspective, is just incredibly high. Now, on the one hand, of course, that's incredibly daunting because it means that companies that have basically been resting on their laurels, are for a rude awakening, right? And in many cases, we've already seen that. But on the other hand, the capabilities that are available to bring this to life are much greater. I mean, part of the reason why I was comfortable leaving Google in 2017 is because most of the tech that my colleagues and I were using, was in the process of being kind of like, say, made available to the public via Google Cloud. So I was like, well, if I'm moving to data role outside Google, whatever, I'm literally using the same stack, right? So, a big reason why our e-com business is doing so well is that we've got a very sophisticated, data platform. We've got a very sophisticated media stack. It's all tied together. And again, 10 years ago, if I tried to do this, it would have been an unbelievably expensive undertaking. So
cloud, I guess, is a big, one of those big unlocks,
and cost of data, processing speed, everything.
Exactly, the software
Moore's
available.
Law,
exactly, and I think the final piece of the puzzle as well is that there's been a kind of a cultural shift where there's less of a dichotomy between what happens in this digital space and the rest of the business, right? And I think what we found is that companies that basically pick one of the extremes, tend to struggle. I mean, there's always edge cases, but again, you in most cases you can't do retail well unless you at least have the ability for customers to engage with you via certain digital touch points, right? Particularly in an age where not everybody has that physical presence, etc. I think COVID was an extreme example of that. But at the same time, where companies have kind of taken the opposite extreme and said, well, it's all about digital and physical is dead. I mean, they're obviously also clearly wrong, right? They're clearly wrong. And like I said, I think it's always very easy.
Don't confuse us with facts.
I'm sorry.
Very confusing.
I forgot where I'm sitting. But I think, look, I mean, this is I think not so much just a retail thing. I think this is just the human condition, right? And you even see this in our political climate. Like people love to love to pick a side, right? They love to kind of like pick an extreme. And I think the businesses that are doing well are those that are able to be moderates. And I know that's wildly uncool to say in this day and age, but I think I'm definitely one of those who's like, hey, listen, let's pick the best from the individual sides.
Sure. Well, before I let you go, because of your background, I think it's so interesting because, as you mentioned earlier, you've got this data science, presumably much more left brain analytics sort of approach to things, and now you work with these brands that are much more art in a lot of respects, and I'm just curious how that background in analytics and data science now in a more emotional, right-brainish, creative sort of category, how that blend has worked. Maybe that gets to your point about being moderate, of being able to synthesize kind of both sides of the brain. But how have you approached that, and how has that informed your leadership style and the work you're doing at Chalhoub?
Yeah, so it's funny. So when I announced this move 2 years ago, I had a ping from a buddy of mine, Jason, who runs this large chief data officer network in Europe, and he goes, good luck, it's a brave move, and
a courageous move. And you're like, oh,
and I go, and I was like, what do you mean? He goes, as far as I know, like you're the first. I'm like, the first what? And he's like, oh, well, the first like chief data officer to explicitly move into a kind of a commercial role. And I'm like, no, that can't be true. And I kind of started digging around, and I haven't been able to find someone else who's been silly enough to do this. But I think the reason why it's worked out okay, I think firstly is because I got a lot of trust from Chairman Patrick, from the board in moving across, which I think is not always the case, right? I mean,
sure.
In fairness, like I'd never owned a P&L before, so it definitely was an element of trust. So I think that's been okay. But then secondly, I think from a data perspective, I was never just interested in, say, the technology and the data side of it. Like I always ask myself, okay, so what? Hey, great, we have this new capability. Like, so what? We have this new data set. So what? Like, what's it going to tell us about a consumer? Like, with this insight, like, how can we apply this? And actually, for Google, for more than a year, my role was like global insights lead, and that really just meant going around and asking internally, like, hey, we now have this data. How are we going to apply this, to our clients' businesses? So I feel like the reality is, I never planned to be here, but looking back, I've been very fortunate to have the kind of experiences and the kind of mentors and the kind of support to kind of like, in a way, prepare me for this. Although is one ever prepared for a retail leadership role? I mean, God knows. Answer on a postcard.
Well, Ryan, thanks so much for joining us here in the Wiseline podcasting studio at the Shoptalk by the beach. It's been a real treat to listen to you and get to know you, and very impressive work you're doing across a very interesting part of the world. So thanks so much for joining Steve and I on the podcast.
Well, shout out to my very talented team and partners, because leaders always say, it takes a village, and sometimes they're lying, right? Because sometimes they're like AI researchers, and it really is just them in a bedroom with a laptop. As we all know, with e-commerce, and particularly with omni-channel, it really does take a village. So credit to them.
Well, congratulations on everything you've accomplished, and continued best of luck.
Thank you so much, guys, for having me.
If you like what you heard, please follow us on Apple, Spotify, your favorite podcast platforms, so you can catch up with all our great interviews, including Judith McKenna, President, International, Walmart. New episodes of Season 6, presented by our friends at Market Dial, will show up each and every Tuesday. And be sure and tell your friends and colleagues in the retail industry all about us.
And I'm Steve Dennis, author of the best-selling book, Remarkable Retail: How to Win and Keep Customers in the Age of Disruption. You can learn more about me, my consulting, and keynote speaking at stephenpdennis.com.
And I'm Michael LeBlanc, consumer retail growth consultant, keynote speaker, and producer, and host of a series of retail trade podcasts, including this one. You can learn even more about me on LinkedIn, and you can catch up with Steve in person and on stage at Shoptalk Europe in Barcelona, May 9th to 11th. You can catch up with me on the stage at Store Conference in Toronto, May 31st. And you can see both of us at the Lead Innovation Summit in July, live on stage in New York with our friend of the pod, Simeon Siegel from BMO. Until then, safe travels, everyone.